She failed 5 times before opening the world's most important school for orphans. For her, failure wasn't the end of the road, it was the blueprint. The morning the roof fell in. The balloons were already tied to the gate, dozens of them, gold and white, tugging against the morning wind like they were desperate to fly away. A hand-painted banner read, "Welcome home, children." The smell of fresh paint still hung in the air. Somewhere inside, a staff member was arranging crayons on brand new desks. Then they heard it. A low crack, a groan from deep within the walls, and then, in one terrible, dust-swallowing second, the entire north wing of the roof gave way. Margaret Maggie Calloway stood in the parking lot of her life's work and watched it collapse for the 5th time. Most people would have quit after the 3rd time the walls crumbled, but for Maggie, failure wasn't an option, it was a blueprint. A girl from Elgin, Illinois who refused to look away. Margaret Calloway grew up in Elgin, Illinois, a middle child in a house of 5, raised on a teacher's salary and her father's unshakable belief that kindness costs nothing. She was the kind of girl who brought stray cats home and argued with her principal about the lunch program. By 17, everyone in her school knew her name. By 22, she had a degree in education from Northwestern University and a fire in her chest that no career counselor knew what to do with. She was 31 years old when her world changed. A car accident on a Tuesday morning took her closest friend, Diana, and left Diana's 3 young children without a parent, without a home, without anyone who knew their middle names or how they liked their eggs. Maggie watched those kids cycle through the foster system like packages nobody wanted to sign for. She watched the oldest one stop speaking. She watched the youngest one start sleeping with his shoes on, as if he expected to be moved in the night. And she made a promise she had no idea how to keep. "I will build them a place," she wrote in her journal that winter. "A real place, not a facility, not a system, a home." The plans, the savings, and the beautiful naivete. For 2 years, Maggie worked 3 jobs: days at an elementary school in Naperville, evenings tutoring the children of Elgin's wealthiest families, weekends waitressing at a diner on Route 20, where the coffee was terrible and the tips were honest. She lived on rice and ambition. She kept a jar on her kitchen counter labeled "The School" and dropped in every spare dollar like she was dropping in prayers. By 2009, she had $47,000 saved, a community of believers behind her, and architectural plans drawn up by a retired builder named Hank Russo, who believed in what she was doing enough to work for nearly nothing. The plot of land was an overgrown lot on the south side of Elgin, donated by a local church that had been sitting on it for 30 years, not knowing what to do with it. On a cold March morning, 23 volunteers showed up with shovels. They broke ground at sunrise. The years that were supposed to break her. What followed were 5 years that would have destroyed anyone else. The first failure, her primary donor, a real estate investor named Robert Haynes, who had pledged $200,000, called her on a Wednesday night, 3 days before the scheduled groundbreaking, to say he was pulling out. His accountant had advised against it. He wished her luck. He didn't sound like he meant it. The second, a spring flash flood in 2011, swept through the construction site and took 18 months of work with it. Maggie stood in knee-deep brown water the morning after, looking at the waterlogged lumber, and did not cry. She called her volunteers and said, "We start again Monday." The third, a neighbor filed a zoning complaint that tied the project in litigation for 14 months. Maggie represented herself in 2 of those hearings. She lost both. The fourth, a contractor named Gary Shields, absconded with $63,000 of donated funds. By the time the police found him in Arizona, the money was gone. Maggie held a bake sale to fill the gap. She made $1,200. She cried in her car on the way home, the only time she allowed herself. And the fifth, the morning the roof collapsed, opening day 2014, just hours before 42 children were scheduled to arrive. The parking lot, the dust, the silence. Maggie sat on the hood of her car and looked at the dust still settling over the building's open wound. A volunteer named Priya, 24 years old, fresh out of college, who had given up a marketing job in Chicago to work on the project, came and sat beside her without a word. They stayed like that for a long time. A school bus turned into the parking lot. The driver, a retired teacher named Frank Obasi, stepped out and looked at the damage. Then he walked to Maggie and said the words that would later be painted on the wall of the finished school. "The children are still on the bus, Maggie. They're still waiting. That hasn't changed." She looked at the bus. Through the foggy windows, she could see small faces. A girl pressing her palm flat against the glass. A boy with a backpack almost as big as he was, sitting very still, the way children who have learned not to want things sit when they're trying not to want something. Maggie got off the hood of her car. She walked to the bus and knocked on the door. When it hissed open, she stepped up and faced 42 pairs of eyes. "We're not ready today," she said, "but I promise you we will be, and when we are, every single one of you will have a desk with your name on it." The phone call from a stranger in Denver. 3 days after the collapse, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune ran a small story. It wasn't front page. It wasn't even a feature. Just 4 paragraphs tucked between a story about traffic and a story about a dog that had learned to skateboard. But a woman named Eleanor Davenport read it over her morning coffee in Denver, Colorado. Eleanor was 68 years old, widowed, and had spent 20 years running a nonprofit that built community centers in underserved neighborhoods. She had a network, resources, and a single question she asked about every project she considered backing. Does the person behind it still believe in it? She called Maggie that afternoon. Maggie answered on the second ring, still smelling of construction dust. Eleanor asked her one question. If you had the funding, what would you do differently this time? Maggie didn't pause. She answered for 22 minutes straight, describing every flaw in the 5 previous attempts, every lesson extracted from every failure, every structural and emotional adjustment she would make. She spoke about trauma-informed classroom design, about therapy gardens and sound-insulated music rooms, and kitchens where children could learn to cook their own meals, because autonomy, she said, was the one thing the foster system never taught them. Eleanor listened to all of it. Then she said, "When can you come to Denver?" The lighthouse rises. What followed was the most disciplined 18 months of Maggie's life. Eleanor's foundation provided $1.4 million, enough to do it right, finally. But more than the money, Eleanor gave Maggie something she had never had before: a team. A structural engineer named Dr. Sofia Reyes redesigned the building from the ground up with flood-resistant foundations and a roof that could bear 3 times the load of a standard structure. A child psychologist named Dr. James Calloway consulted on every room: the colors, the acoustics, the light. A chef named Marcus Webb designed a kitchen program that would teach every child to feed themselves and others. Hank Russo, 81 years old now, moving slowly but precisely, came out of retirement to oversee the build personally. On a clear Tuesday morning in September 2016, they held a second groundbreaking ceremony. Only 12 people attended. No press, no speeches, no banners. Just 12 people with shovels and Maggie Calloway, who pressed her palm against the cold Elgin soil before she broke it and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "This is the last time I do this. We're going to get it right." They got it right. $1.4 million total funding, 18 months build time, 47 staff hired, 6th attempt. Opening day, the one that held. The Lighthouse Academy opened on a warm morning in April 2018. No fanfare, no cameras, no speeches. Just the sound of a school bus pulling into a parking lot where the asphalt was still new, and the smell of pancakes drifting from the kitchen where Marcus Webb had been cooking since 5 a.m. Frank Obasi drove the bus. He had driven it every morning for 4 years, even when there was nowhere to go, just looping through Elgin with no passengers, maintaining the habit, believing the day would come. It came. 112 children walked through the doors of the Lighthouse Academy that morning. Each one had a desk with their name on it, written in the handwriting of the staff member who would be their homeroom anchor. Each desk had a small potted plant and the handwritten card that said, "This seat is yours. You belong here. This is home." A girl named Jasmine, 9 years old, who had been in 7 foster placements in 3 years, stood at the threshold of her classroom and did not move for a long moment. The teacher, a young woman named Priya Sharma, the same Priya who had sat on the car hood in the parking lot, waited. Then Jasmine walked in, sat down at her desk, and ran her fingers over her name. She said nothing, but she took off her coat, the first sign, the child psychologist would later note, that she had decided she wasn't leaving. Maggie watched from the hallway window. She did not go in. Some moments are not meant to be witnessed up close. What the failures were always building. 6 years later, the Lighthouse Academy is home to 1,200 children across 4 campuses in Illinois, Ohio, Colorado, and Texas. Its model, trauma-informed, community-anchored, radically human, has been studied by educators from 34 countries. 3 of its graduates have gone on to college on full scholarships. 1 is studying architecture. In interviews, Maggie Calloway is always asked the same question: how did you keep going after 5 failures? Her answer has never changed. I didn't keep going despite the failures. I kept going because of them. Every collapse taught me something the blueprints couldn't. The flood taught me about foundations. The fraud taught me about accountability structures. The roof taught me that I had been rushing, that I had been building for the deadline instead of building for the children. She pauses at this point every time and looks at whoever is asking the question as if she is handing them something fragile. The 5th failure was the most important one because it happened the morning of opening day, when everything looked finished. That taught me that almost isn't the same as right. And it's the most important lesson I've ever learned. Don't confuse completion with correctness. Build it until it's right, not until it looks right. On the wall above the entrance to the original Lighthouse Academy campus in Elgin, Illinois, in hand-painted letters placed there by Maggie herself, are the words Frank Obasi said in the parking lot the morning the 5th roof fell. "The children are still waiting. That hasn't changed." If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.